Storm force coverage continues now at 10:30. Tide trouble for a third time. These are live pictures of Sandwich. High tide about an hour and a half away. You can see those waves just coming closer and closer to shore. The concerns along the coast right now.
Fierce storm flooding homes, leading to rescues throughout the day and into the overnight hours in Quincy. We'll have a live look at some of the damage left behind.
And trees just snapping like twigs, knocking out power across New England. How long the lights could be out.
This is 7 News Today in New England.
And this is a scene in Scituate right now. You can see all that water just flooding the streets there, flooding backyards and homes there as we continue to monitor conditions and wait for that third high tide. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday. I'm Amaka Ubaka.
And I'm Chris Anderson. It's been a wild morning already, and a travel ban. It's in effect still in Marshfield and Scituate because of the high water. Trees and power lines down everywhere, so it makes for dangerous conditions. And many of the roads are simply blocked. You can't get through them.
And we've got you covered. We have live team coverage from the hardest hit areas to families now cleaning up, beginning with meteorologist Chris Lambert.
Unfortunately, it's a rinse and repeat forecast for these tides here. This will be the third consecutive one where we're featuring moderate to major coastal flooding. High tide in Boston just after noon, and we're close to the noontime hours and a lot of the high tides around the area, though Nantucket more like 1 o'clock this afternoon. This is the issue. You have big waves, a lot of energy working in toward the coastline. You have a tide that's astronomically high, and then you throw a storm surge, which is the rise in the ocean level here because of the strong winds and the strong storm of 2.5 to 3 feet, and it all adds up to spell some issues with these tides. Now, yesterday at noon, or right around noon, or just before noon in Boston, we hit the third highest tide on record in the city of Boston. Thinking this one here coming in midday, probably more on the order of like 14.2, 14.3. Right now, the surge in Boston Harbor is running at 2.8 feet. So you throw that on top of an expected astro tide of 11.5, and not to make you do math, this much math, you know, early on a Saturday morning. But the bottom line is I expect these numbers to be somewhere in between in the city of Boston of the flooding that we had last night and the flooding that we had during the day yesterday. So very similar look. Now, down along the South Shore, it's a little more concerning from Hull down towards Scituate, Marshfield, Sandwich, over toward Barnstable, because you still have a strong north wind pushing in these big waves and a lot of water pitting it at the coastline. So you're more susceptible to major coastal flooding here, and you're going to see more video of these huge waves crashing into the seawall and almost exploding up and over some of these shoreline houses here. Incredible video that we've seen out of Marshfield from yesterday, likely seeing more of that as we go through the day today. Of course, a lot of this driven by the strong winds, and in some instances hurricane force winds yesterday. And for more on that list, we'll go over to meteorologist Ryan Clare.
Good morning. Yeah, these winds have really made a mess. We saw peak gusts of even 93 miles per hour in Barnstable. Woods Hole seen peak gusts of 88 miles per hour. Boston managing gusts of 70 miles per hour. So it has been, again, quite the windy weather for us. That's meaning a lot of cleanup here this morning. And we saw soaking rain, anywhere from 2 inches of rain in Boston to close to 4 inches of rain in Randolph, even more than that in Bridgewater, with about 6 inches of rain. And most of us fell between 2 to 4 across central and eastern Mass. So we do still have this wind advisory. In fact, it's been expanded a little bit farther into Plymouth and Bristol counties, not just across the immediate coastline. Buzzards Bay, part of this advisory, as well as southern Rhode Island and Connecticut. Now the National Weather Service has brought this high wind warning back into the mix for the Cape and the islands, but most of us are talking about gusts up to about 50 miles per hour. Cape and islands can see some gusts up to about 60, 65 miles per hour. Still coastal flooded warning, in effect through late tonight. Moderate to major coastal flooding is likely. And we're going to start to see that ramp up now into the next half hour, especially between 11 o'clock and about 1 here this afternoon. So we're getting into the thick of things in the next hour for us. Back to you guys.
All right, Ren, thank you. People on the Cape dealing with the brunt of the storm and a lot of the damage now left behind.
But the concern right now is that third high tide. We want to go back now to 7's Carrie Corrado. She's live for us in Sandwich. Carrie.
Well, Amaka, today I showed you some of the flooding. I showed you down power lines and trees, but now I want to show you some property damage that we found. These are the homes that were on the front lines getting slammed by these waves and the heavy winds. And if I bring you over here, this is a porch right here in the beach. This porch, I am told, was connected to this house right here. So you can only imagine the power of this wind and these waves to basically just sweep it off the house, and now it's laying right here in the middle of the beach. I also want to show you this. If we get a little bit closer here, the foundation all underneath this house has basically been wiped out too. So from afar, it looks like the house is floating if you stand in the front. But as you can see, the tide, it's starting to inch closer and closer to us. I wanted to show you these conditions because the tide is approaching, high tide is approaching, and this ocean is angry. And you can see all those white caps out there, and those waves, they're getting pushed in every direction possible. And what I can't show you is some of the property damage all up and down this coastline. There is debris from fences, there's cinder block, there's beach umbrellas. It's scattered all up and down this beach. And many people are coming to check it out, take a look at it for themselves. But again, that tide is inching closer and closer. So again, there is that flooding concern, but a lot of beach erosion, power outages down trees, and property damage here in Sandwich.
Cinder blocks all over the place. I mean, those are about 35 pounds a pop, Carrie, and they're just being tossed around like they're small stones, and the damage all around there. Have you talked to residents there? Are they concerned, or is everybody out of there?
Well, you know what, Chris? I just spoke to one resident. Where I'm standing, there was a huge sand dune. And it was basically, they brought in sand, they created this dune to protect some of these houses, but because of the wind, because of the waves, it basically vanished, and this is what we're left with. It's pretty remarkable when you get up close to some of these houses to see that the entire foundation was moved. And these are cinder blocks here. These aren't your, I mean, it's even hard for me to move, but these aren't rocks. These are cinder blocks that were underneath, holding that house up, that were pushed away from these waves and this wind. And this deck, to see how, quickly that was just swiped underneath, and now it's laying here. A lot of property damage out here.
All right, Carrie, thank you. Carrie Corrado live for us in Sandwich this morning. And in Duxbury now, officials asking people to stay off the roads there. And you can see why looking at this video. Many people there waking up in the dark this morning as well. 97% of the town going to bed last night without any power. And a horse was rescued in Duxbury as well. You can see this horse. It was trapped under the debris. This is actually after the fact. The department was able to save Rocky, the horse, and they say right now he's doing just fine.
South Shore obviously is taking the brunt of this storm. Bracing for that third high tide now, just about an hour and a half away, less than that, and we're going to start seeing the effects probably starting at 11 o'clock, and it could create dangerous conditions for people in those areas, and they've already been slammed with massive waves and severe flooding from the first two high tides.
Yeah, some of the waves coming up higher than the homes there. Let's go out to 7's John Coco in Scituate with a look at the damage that families are really waking up to this morning. John.
Yeah, Malka, Chris mentioned the flooding. Take a look behind me here. This is Otis Road in Scituate. If you take a look out this way, you can see it's just completely covered in water. And this is just one of many roads here in Scituate that look exactly like this. And it's not just the roads, because if you take a look over this way, you can see all that water is in people's backyards as well. And we can see this water in the backyards because this fence just completely blown out here. Now, officials here in town say they're asking for 12 more hours of commitment from people. They want to make sure people stay home, and they want to make sure that people stay off the roads. There is a travel ban in effect here in Scituate, and when you take a look at Old Otis Road here, you can tell that's why they have that travel ban in effect, because there's so much water on the roads here. A lot of damage in some of these areas. Take a look at this backyard over here as well. We were standing here throughout the morning. This gives you kind of a perspective if you remember some of those live shots. I was standing right there on those steps to this house, and you can see all of the water that is in this backyard here. So a lot of wind damage, a lot of water. 92% of the people here in Scituate are still without power.
And John, before you go, we're an hour and a half away from that third high tide. Talk about some of the concerns that not only the officials have been talking about all morning, but also residents who live there as well.
Well, Mark, I can tell you, as we were driving back up to this location, we had to go to a press conference with town officials at around 9 o'clock this morning. But as we were driving back, we noticed down the road here, you could actually see the waves coming up and over into this area again. So you mentioned an hour and a half from that next high tide, that final high tide. Well, you can see that's already coming this way, and hopefully we'll be able to stay where we are here. But that's not that's not guaranteed, just because we could start seeing some of that water start flowing again. One thing that town officials did mention, there's been no injuries so far here in Scituate, and they would like to keep it that way.
All right, John, thank you. That is some good news coming out of Scituate. No injuries so far. All right, we're going to go to Marshfield now. This is new video of the waves crashing along the coast. You can see the strength of the storm with basically that wall of water just slamming those homes. That concern continuing right now for the next hour and a half or so with the high tide approaching fast.
Okay, we have some more video for you to take a look at. A little comparison, 24-hour difference here between yesterday when that high tide tore through and then this morning. A car almost completely covered by the waters in Quincy, and you see the white roof poking out of the top of the water. On the right this morning, just about 45 minutes ago, that is the same vehicle, and much of that water has receded. Earlier this morning, we spoke to a family that was reunited today after they were separated during that storm.
It wasn't that bad. Our house stayed pretty warm, you know, with a lot of blankets. It wasn't bad.
It was bad. There were cars floating, people. We passed 3 floating cars. There is no heat. We've had no electricity for 2 days, or we won't have it for 2 days, but she's clearly more optimistic than I am.
Quincy's mayor spoke a little earlier this morning and said that the city's going to do everything it can do to help the affected families recover and get back into their homes as soon as possible. Again, we got to get through that third high tide first.
Yes, and it seems like she had a decent attitude about the whole situation.
Sometimes you just have to laugh at it when you're okay.
All right, our storm force coverage continues in just a moment.
Let's go back down South Shore onto the Cape now. Sandwich, where the water is angry once again. Look at the angry ocean, the water churning, those white caps getting more intense. 10:41 is your time. You're watching the news station. Storm force coverage continues when we come back.
Storm force coverage this morning. Here's a live look at Sandwich, and you can see, I mean, 7's Carrie Corrado was talking about this earlier, all that debris that is washed up on the shore there because of those strong winds, and you can see these, you know, intense waves building as we get closer and closer to that third high tide.
Do you know what that was? And maybe if our photographer can hear me, pan over to your right a little bit. Do you know what that was? That's someone's deck. These are cinder blocks that was for the house on the left. That was their foundation. There's somebody's deck that was ripped off, and it's just sitting there. There was a sand dune, according to Carrie Corrado, that was supposed to be protecting a lot of those things, and it just was washed away.
Wow. And Chris Lambert, as we look at these pictures, can you talk about what areas you're most concerned about with this, you know, third high tide?
Yeah, that's one of it, because, you know, you're looking there on the shoreline and you're looking out on the water. That wind's hitting you right in the face, so it's pushing the water levels over to the coastline, and you still have a few feet to go of that water level rising, so you may see some more structural damage there in Sandwich. And still concerned with that up through Marshfield, Scituate, Hull, and basically right along the north side of Cape Cod as you face into Cape Cod Bay and also into Nantucket Harbor. In the city of Boston, where do we find ourselves? Right around the midday high tide. Now, the astronomical tide's a little bit higher than it was last night, and the storm surge probably close to what we had last night. So that's going to put us in the ballpark of a level around 14.2, 14.3. So between the tides, the two tides that we had, so very similar coastal flooding expected to what we've seen over the last couple of high tides, and that's significant because we've seen a lot of coastal flooding here over the last couple of high tides. And again, with the north to northeasterly winds still very prevalent along the south shore, I think a lot of that water is going to get pushed in. And look at the wave action. Tremendous amount of waves expanding over a huge area out in the open waters of the Atlantic. This yellow and orange, that's 25 to 40-foot waves out there. And even as you get into some of these greens, you notice on that list it's 15, 20 to 25. Not to say that you have 25-foot waves crashing on the shorelines, but you don't have to go very far offshore to find these 20, 25-foot swells out there. So there's a lot of wave energy working in, and you do get some big waves and powerful waves that get propagated back toward the coastline, crash into the seawalls, go up and over the seawalls, and, you know, can do damage because of the power and momentum they have behind it. High tide around noontime, Newburyport into Gloucester, into the city of Boston as well. Expecting Boston Harbor moderate coastal flooding. You know, it's going to be very similar to what we saw yesterday, where it rises up, it comes in, it inundates places like near the seaport and down near the aquarium, and then, you know, it recedes pretty easily as we get closer toward low tide there. So, you know, for a couple hours you deal with it in Boston, and then it goes back out. Where you have the wave action that's the highest will be across Newburyport, Plum Island, Gloucester, and then from Hull down through Scituate, Plymouth, Brant Rock, Marshfield, Sandwich, over toward Barnstable and Dennis as well. That's where we're concerned with the combination of these waves rolling in with a lot of energy and that water level rise creating moderate to major coastal flooding once again during this high tide. And same case, I mean, Provincetown, minor to moderate in the harbor here because you're a little bit protected from that north wind. But with that huge ocean storm now to the south and east of us, fair game for Chatham on the eastern side of it to at least get moderate coastal flooding. And then thinking with Nantucket, with that north wind just driving the water in, likely seeing moderate to major coastal flooding in Nantucket Harbor. The wind is still an issue out there. We're still gusting near 40 miles an hour and occasionally seeing 50 to 60 across the Cape and the Islands as we go throughout the day. Probably more like 45 to 55 this afternoon. So the power crews, they have their hands full too because they're trying to get the power restored, but you're battling these gusty little showers that are occasionally working on through, as well as some strong winds. Coating to a couple inches of snow likely Sunday night into early Monday morning, and then we'll watch the potential of more significant storm on Wednesday, although this one has a little more speed to it in terms of how fast it comes in and goes out. So I think that would limit the coastal impacts to not nearly the level that we saw during this past storm, guys.
All right, Chris, thank you. A very active March so far. We're going to head over to Boston now, and 7's Kim Lucy, who's live for us there. Kim.
Maka, like we said, we moved back a little bit so we can show you where that water is coming in around the side here at Long Wharf. We showed you the waves at the end, and this is where it rushes in along the side next to the chart house. And this is actually what trapped a couple of cars yesterday because that's a low spot there. We had some vehicles get stuck. Now, unfortunately, as you can see, we still have some spectators out there at the point on Long Wharf, and we've been warning people that this water does come up quickly, and unfortunately, you have to be very careful that you're not getting trapped by this high tide. Now, if you look up from there, you can see just how gusty the winds are right now. As I mentioned, they picked up quite a bit in about the last hour to hour and a half, right as the tide started really coming in. Again, the MBTA is here keeping an eye on the aquarium station. They say that, yes, we did see the water go in during the high tide, the first one yesterday, but they fared pretty well during the second one. So now they're waiting to see how the third one went, and they are remarking on the same thing. We think that it looks about the same as it did during the first one so far. So we'll be keeping an eye on it here. Live at Long Wharf, Kim Lucy, 7 News Today, New England.
Okay, Kim's in Boston. We checked out the South Shore. Let's head north. Gloucester now, and a look at the two strongest storms of the season. A little comparison for you. On the left, you can see the high school yesterday dealing with some serious flooding. On the right, well, we saw that significant storm back in January. There was a lot of freezing. That whole parking lot was flooded and frozen over. So January 4th was obviously a different ball game for them than what they saw yesterday.
Well, and a lot of people still recovering from that January 4th storm, and then to have this mess come. So still a lot of cleanup ahead for sure.
Absolutely.
All right, we're continuing our storm force coverage on this Saturday morning. We want to go live again to Scituate and take a look at these pictures. You can see the waves behind all that sand there that's building as the next high tide comes around 12:05 this afternoon. We're monitoring this area and all of Massachusetts really in the next hour and a half. So stay with the news station.
Good morning. It is Saturday, 10:53 your time. Live look at Marshfield now, and we're zoomed in a little bit so you can see the water on the streets there. We're about ready to start what is that cycle of a high tide where we start to rise, climb up to that 12:05 peak, and then it starts to come back down. So we'll have to keep watching to see what Mother Nature has in store for us.
We will be watching very closely, and we want to stay with the South Shore right now. We want to go back to 7's John Coco. He is live for us in Scituate with more. John.
So, Maka, right now you can see that they have this road here blocked off behind me. And if you take a look all the way down this road here at that brown house, and you see these waves coming up, this is what town officials are afraid of. This is what they're keeping an eye on right now. We've actually seen some of these waves just within the last few minutes coming up and over that house. You can see just how high they are right now. So that is a major concern. Of course, this is what we've been dealing with throughout the morning. If you take a look over here in these backyards, all of this water, all of this flooding. So you take those waves, you add in that high tide, and you add that to what we already have here in these backyards, that is a recipe for disaster. So town officials want to make sure that people stay inside, they stay off the roads. There's that travel ban in effect. They're asking for 12 more hours of commitment from people here in Scituate. That's the latest live here in Scituate. John Coco, 7 News, Today New England.
Wow. What's remarkable is earlier, John was about a half-mile inland, and they were still flooded.
I know. It's just they're dealing with remarkable flooding in that area and so many others, too. All right, our storm force coverage continues up next. We want to take a live look at Sandwich, and you can see that the ocean is getting angry. You can see the waves. They are churning up right now as we're about an hour away from high tide. It's 10:54 right now, and we'll be right back after the break. We're back with storm force coverage. Here's a live look at Sandwich, and you can see that debris just washing on shore. These heavy winds as we get ready for that third high tide that's just about a little more than an hour away.
Yeah, the cinder blocks, the foundation of that home. Scituate, similar situation. You see the flooded streets. High tide coming in less than an hour, so we'll have to keep watching closely.
We want to get a final check of what it looks like in Boston, and you can see the winds are starting to pick up out there. It looks like crews are getting ready as that third high tide gets ready to move on in. Of course, we'll continue to monitor things throughout the afternoon.
Kim, Lucy's moved back. Good move, because that water is going to start moving in. And that's all the time we have this morning for 7 News Today in New England, but we appreciate you staying with us. I'm Chris Anderson.
And I'm Amaka Ubaka. Don't forget, for all of the day's top stories, check out WHDH.com. And, of course, be sure to stay with 7 News.